On today's episode of Locked On Mets, I'm going to give you my realistic plan for what I believe the Mets should do this offseason when it comes to addressing their biggest needs through free agency.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Locked On Mets is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Now, I just finished up writing my off-season outlook for the New York Mets for justbaseball.com, and on today's show, we're going to go through that. So in the first segment, I'll talk about the Mets' impending free agents. Who should they look to retain? Who should they let walk? In the second segment, I'll talk about the biggest needs this club needs to address this offseason. And then in the last segment, I will give you my realistic plan that the Mets should follow to make themselves a real contender in 2022. Before we get into any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing about the Mets, as I just mentioned, at justbaseball.com, where I worked on this offseason outlook. And if you go right now and just look at who the Mets' impending free agents are, this is obviously the first place the Mets have to start when planning out their offseason. And they already got the ball rolling with the qualifying offers, extending them to both Michael Conforto and Noah Syndergaard. That was our last two episodes of this show, talking about Syndergaard on Monday, who looks to be returning to the Mets, and then Conforto, who is almost definitely leaving, already declined the qualifying offer, and is expected to sign elsewhere in free agency. Going through the list of other free agents, you have Javier Baez, Marcus Stroman, Aaron Loup, and Jonathan Villar. That is the class that I would say is most likely to return, or at least the ones that the Mets should be trying to pursue. All of them had good years. Baez and Stroman we'll talk about more because they are clearly the premier guys. Jonathan Villar, I think, is a very interesting case because, for one, he is a great running joke and theme of this show because I was vehemently against him at the start of the season. And then after he continued to make me eat my words, eventually fans of this show had me buy a Jonathan Villar jersey, which I still proudly own. The only actual legitimate like MLB certified jersey I own right now is Jonathan Villar. So I have a bias to wanting him back, but moreover, it's just the fact that he had a really good year, provides coverage at a lot of positions. So he is an interesting case that the Mets should look to explore depending on what role he wants and how much money he wants in free agency. Then you have Aaron Loup, who had an unbelievable season. Can he replicate that is the question. From there, you have Kevin Pillar, who decided to become a free agent. He had a player option, and essentially the way that player option broke down, $2.9 million. If he declined it, the Mets had the opportunity to accept the team option that I believe was over $6. Regardless, they were never going to pick that option up. It came down to Pillar. Did he want to play for $2.9 million when there was a $1.5 million buyout, I believe? So it was essentially deciding on whether he wanted that $1.4 million or if he could get more than that on the open market. He decides to be a free agent. There is a chance the Mets would revisit bringing him back. He was a big leader on this club, but I think if you've been listening to this show throughout the season, you know my feelings on Kevin Pillar. Great guy, great leader, not a great hitter. And I think that the Mets have wasted far too many assets over the last 3 years trying to acquire guys like Pillar, Keon Broxton, Jake Marisnick. Let Khalil Lee be your fourth outfielder next year and bring in a couple of guys, minor league signings that can compete with them in spring training, but there's no reason to commit any serious money to a Kevin Pillar this offseason. From there, you have Jeurys Familia, Dellin Betances, and Heath Hembree. Obviously, Familia was the only one that had a really big impact on the Mets bullpen, although Hembree had some good outings down the stretch there. One of those additions that you almost forget was even on the Mets, but he actually did pitch pretty well. Regardless, I don't expect any of those guys back. If any of them would come back, it would be Familia because he just loves being a Met so much. I know fans are ready for that ship to sail, but what I would say is if Jeurys Familia comes back on a low-end major league deal, I think he is fine. He still pitched a lot of games for you, was decent the past 2 years. He was terrible in his first year with the Mets in 2019 since coming back after that midseason trade in 2018, but there's still life on his fastball, still has a lot of movement. Walks too many guys, gave up way too many home runs this year, but as the seventh man in your bullpen, he's fine. So maybe if Familia comes back, I just would not count on it. So if you look at that group, what it really boils down to is it boils down to the decisions on Javier Baez and Marcus Stroman. Those are the two biggest free agents you still have that you got to make your choice on whether you want to, try to re-up with them or let them walk. Michael Conforto would have fallen into that class, but as I explained going into great detail on yesterday's show, which you can find on the Locked On Mets YouTube channel or on your podcast feed, I just don't see that as a realistic possibility. So what we're going to talk about next is what is the biggest hole on the Mets roster. Is Baez and Stroman, are they the answers to fill their biggest needs? What else should they be looking at this offseason? We'll get to all of that in just a minute. I love Thanksgiving. All the good food and treats, and dessert is always the best part of any feast. But maybe this year you want a yummy dessert that isn't so chock full of calories and sugar. It's the perfect time for a Built Bar. Built Bar is the new holiday dessert where you can feast on something delicious but feel good about it. One slice of pie is upwards of 300 calories, and that's on the low end, whereas most Built Bars are only 130 calories and only 4 grams of sugar with plenty of protein. Replace that coconut cream pie with a coconut Built Bar or go for a raspberry Built Bar instead of a raspberry pie. There's lots of good flavors that replace any pie that come low in calories, low in carbs, low in fat, but they are high in protein and they come covered in 100% chocolate. Built Bar is a great option for when you're hungry. There's new surprises all month with limited time flavors arriving at built.com regularly. So check the site often. There's nothing like a Built Bar Black Friday. So mark your calendars because Black Friday will be a huge event with all sorts of surprises. All you have to do is go to built.com, use the promo code LOCK15. You'll get 15% off your next order. Again, that's promo code LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. All right, so let's get into the Mets' biggest areas of need this offseason. We've talked about a lot of this already throughout the offseason, but I really wanted to nail down what the Mets have to address right now. And if you go through their team, it's clear they need to add 2 starters. I think that is pretty safe to assume because you have Pete Alonso. He's going to be locked in at first base. Francisco Lindor's going to be your shortstop. Brandon Nimmo is going to be likely your center fielder unless the Mets get just a standout defensive center fielder and then move Nimmo over to left or right. At catcher, I don't believe the Mets are going to address that position 2 off seasons in a row. They're going to count on a James McCann bounce back. Tomas Nato is a great defensive catcher. So they're locked in there. So if you go through that, that is 4 of your positions that are pretty much set in stone. From there, you got Jeff McNeil, who, if not traded, is going to be on this team in some capacity in the starting lineup, whether that is in left field, at second base, or third base. When it comes to DH, I almost look at that as a locked-in position as well because you have Robinson Cano. And again, this is assuming the universal DH is in fact part of the new CBA, which we all are pretty much operating under that assumption at this point. So with that said, between Cano, between JD Davis or Dominic Smith, whoever stays, between Mark Vientos rising through the ranks, I think you're fine at DH. So right there, we got 6 positions locked in. Where do you still have needs? Well, you got the outfield potential, you got third base, second base. I say you have to add 2 starters. Really, it's more like 3, but I think the Mets can get away with one of their positions being a little bit in flux with some room for some of the incumbents to fill in and end up earning a starting role, like a Dominic Smith in left field, whether that's Mark Vientos, surprising all of us at third base. We got to spend a lot of time on Vientos this offseason because I've talked about it already in passing, but I just think he is right in that same window that Pete Alonso was in heading into the 2019 season, where he can really surprise people and win a job in spring training if he improves that defense. But basically, what you are looking at right now is you need at least one legitimate set it and forget it outfielder like a Starling Marte, and you need one kind of similar set it and forget it infielder, whether that's Javier Baez or just pick any of your big name free agents out there. And so if you look at the prospect of Baez, it still seems like the most obvious free agent fit for the Mets because they traded Pete Crow Armstrong to acquire Baez. And ever since they made that deal, I have been operating under the belief that Baez would be back next year. It just makes way too much sense. They traded a top 5 prospect to get him. He was great with the Mets in that final stretch of the season. Hit 299, 371 on base, 515 slugging, a 143 WRC plus, which again is weighted runs created plus, measuring a league average, measuring your hitters based on a league average of 100. So Javier Baez of the 143 WRC plus means he was 43% better than your league average hitter after that trade. So he was great. He cut down the strikeouts. He got more walks. I don't expect him to hit 299 with a 371 on base for a full season. I'd imagine he would hit closer into the 250 range with an on base percentage, maybe in the 330s. But at the end of the day, he's going to give you great defense. He's going to provide a ton of energy. He's going to get Francisco Lindor to be at his best. And the two of them up the middle defensively is just an amazing foundation to build upon. So I look at Javier Baez right now as such a clear-cut fit for this Mets team. They could let him walk, and I think that's what you have to weigh. You have to weigh whether it is worth it to just maybe lock yourself into a guy that you potentially shouldn't have traded for at the deadline if you don't believe in him long term, and you would have instead believed in keeping a prospect with the upside of a Pete Crow Armstrong. You don't want to double down on what could have been a mistake, right? If you could instead get a Marcus Semien who hit 45 home runs for the Toronto Blue Jays, is that a better fit? Is going all in on a Chris Bryant or a Carlos Correa, who's going to cost more, maybe even 2 times as much for Chris Bryant, who knows, maybe 3 times as much for Carlos Correa? But do you have the money and want to just explode the luxury tax and get one of those guys who maybe has a higher floor and a higher ceiling than Baez instead of bringing, Baez back? I think these are all questions the Mets have to answer, but we are being realistic on this episode of Locked On Mets. There's plenty of time to dream. There's plenty of time to talk about Chris Bryant leaving a great situation in San Francisco, which I believe he's going to stay in, but we can pretend that he's going to come to the Mets. We can do all of those shows at some point, but this is about being realistic. And to me, the first step of a realistic offseason is to bring back Javier Baez, and then is to continue to fill out that roster. And that's what we're going to get to in just a minute here. I want to go through the other two main signings along with Baez that I think make this team a lot better and put you in a great position to really be smart, find the value throughout the offseason as long as you lock down these three big signings, Baez and two others. BetOnline is back and better than ever, now featuring a new web interface for the start of the basketball season with more props, odds, and lines available than ever before. BetOnline remains your number one spot for all the basketball and football action this season. Head to their new updated desktop or mobile website to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit by using our promo code LOCKEDON. From basketball to football to NHL, boxing, and UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games, don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. BetOnline, where the game starts. So if last offseason taught us anything about the New York Mets and how they're going to be covered, they will be in the mix for all of your big ticket free agents, every person on the market who's available through trade. The Mets are going to be in on all of them. And part of that is because Steve Cohen is really aggressive and the Mets are going to do their due diligence. The other part of that is because Steve Cohen has those deep pockets, any agent who's worth their weight is going to just throw the Mets name out there to try to goose up the value for their best clients. If they can say that Chris Bryant is in serious talks with the New York Mets while they're negotiating a deal with San Francisco, maybe you can squeeze an extra year out of them. They're going to use the Mets as that type of a pawn because they're the big market team. They've been doing this forever when it comes to the Yankees, the Mets, the Red Sox, the Dodgers. These are always teams that are going to be linked to plenty of players, but you have to cut through the noise and find out what actually makes sense, what's actually realistic. And that's why I already addressed Javier Baez on the show today, because it just makes sense. If you have Baez playing second, Jeff McNeil can be your left fielder. You can lock that in. I think that because of the questionable chemistry between McNeil and Lindor, it might serve McNeil to just be out in left field. He plays the position really well. I think if you put him out there, you tell him you're going to be a left fielder, you cut this super utility stuff, although it's always nice to have. But if you just tell him you are an everyday left fielder and you don't even leave that door open for him to play anywhere else, hopefully it allows him to settle in and maybe have a better offensive season. So if that is the starting point with Baez at second, Lindor at short, Pete Alonso at first, you got McNeil and Nimmo in the outfield. You're looking at maybe right field and third base, and that's where we get back to the guy I've already talked about a ton, which is Starling Marte. You can find the 2 or 3 episodes where I've discussed Marte and why he'd be a great fit for the Mets. But it just adds some defense out there. It provides insurance for Nimmo, who could go down with an injury at any time. I think he's going to continue to play well for at least 2 or 3 more years. And that is your window right now. So if you have to give him a 4-year deal, even if you have to give him a 4-year deal with a 5th-year option, it's worth it to lock that down. And if you do, if you get Marte and Baez, now the only hole's third base. And I think that's where Jonathan VR can come back into play. You could sign him. Right now, I saw the latest projection was 2 years, $14 million for Jonathan VR. That's certainly an interesting contract, a deal that you could always get off of if he didn't fit into your plans, because let's just say a Brett Beatty or some other players broke through the scene in 2023. You don't need a VR. That's not a contract that would really hamstring you in any way. So if you were to bring VR back, who you already know can play in New York, had a nice season. Well, now I look at the Mets and I say they got a ton of options at third base. I'm not saying VR is going to start 150 games or he played 142 this year. I'm not saying that, but between VR, between Robinson Cano, who can get some time at third base, between Mark Vientos, between Brett Beatty, between Louis Guillorme, like your team has a ton of coverage across the board. You can make a select signing here or there. If you want to, Chris Taylor is another option that is going to cost a lot more than VR, but provides more upside, more versatility, can be a really good outfielder as well as played third base. So that's another sign the Mets should consider. But just looking at the starting lineup, if you were to get Baez and Marte and bring back VR, you're in a pretty good position. But that is not the third signing I was referring to. The big 3 signings I was mentioning, it was Marte, it's Baez, and it's Marcus Stroman. Actually, I'm wearing a Marcus Stroman shirt today in honor of this podcast and talking about why Stroh should come back. I think that the Mets have a lot of different options with their rotation. And if Stroman presses himself out of Queens, I don't think it is the end all be all, but we're talking about a realistic plan to your offseason. And I don't believe that reuniting with Marcus Stroman is unrealistic, even if it ultimately costs you $25 million a year. And here's why. When you look at the long-term commitments to your starting rotation, right now there is none. I mean, Jacob deGrom, the longest-term commitment, has an opt-out after this season. Obviously, you want to keep deGrom for the rest of his career, but just looking at your books, they are pretty open. And who knows what's going to happen with deGrom and his injury history coming into this year? Who knows what Noah Syndergaard is going to look like? Who knows what Carlos Carrasco is going to look like? But you can get out of that contract soon as well. So as much as we talk about these great commitments that the Mets already have financially, in the rotation, it is pretty open. And Marcus Stroman provides the highest floor of any free agent starting pitcher on the market. I know Robbie Ray and Kevin Gausman are coming off great years, but Kevin Gausman struggled down the stretch. Robbie Ray was a different pitcher this year than he's been throughout his career, in my opinion. A good strikeout guy, but I don't know if you're always going to get that. I also am just a little bit cautious about his personality coming to New York. I just remember at the end of the season, him getting really hot a couple of times. And I don't know. I'm just not so sure if that's the best fit. Marcus Stroman thrived in New York this past season. And I think if you bring him back, let's just look at the overall composition of your team. Your rotation now would be Jacob deGrom, Marcus Stroman, Noah Syndergaard, Carlos Carrasco, Taijuan Walker. That's a 5-man rotation locked in. You got David Peterson. You got Tyler McGill. I believe Trevor Williams could come back as well, as long as the Mets don't non-tender him. Now you've got a ton of depth in that rotation as well. Like that rotation, if Stroman comes back in, it's pretty locked in place. I love the upside they already have, even if Stroman doesn't come back. But he's the type of floor move you have to make to solidify the whole thing, to anchor that rotation, especially considering the year that DeGrom just came off of only making 15 starts and not coming back for that second half. If you sign Baez and Marte, as they already addressed, now your starting lineup makes a lot of sense. From there, you still got to add to your bullpen. Aaron Loup, obviously, is another free agent that I know fans really want back. My only hesitation there, you look at his xFIP, and I know fans hate it when I throw these numbers at you, but a lot of times the advanced analytics do prove to be true. His xFIP was 3.37. That's expected fielding independent pitching. That is the expectation of what his ERA should be in future performance. So, with that said, considering he pitched to a 0.95 ERA, I don't want to pay him off of the 0.95 ERA. And if somebody else will pay him, which could be north of $10 million for a 33-year-old that's never pitched up to that level in his career, I'm just cautious of giving out that contract. And I would prefer looking for a different free agent. Now, if you can get him for something closer to what Trevor May got last offseason, which was just shy of 16 million over 2 years with 15.5, that is a little more attractive to me, especially not having to give him a third year, which would have him pitching into his mid 30s. So, look, there's a lot of decisions the Mets have to make. But when it comes to this offseason and formulating a realistic plan, I don't think there's anything unrealistic about getting Javier Baez, Starling Marte, and Marcus Stroman as your three big moves. Is it as sexy as Carlos Correa, Chris Bryant, and Max Scherzer? Of course not. But you know what? Is that really a realistic way to build out your ball club? Do you really think the Mets can pay Chris Bryant, Carlos Correa, and Francisco Lindor? Oh, and also have Max Scherzer and Jacob deGrom in the rotation? It is an amazing fantasy baseball video game type team, but it's not realistic unless the Mets want to have a $400 million payroll. And let's just say you do that and Bryant and Correa have terrible years. Now you're locked into this team for 6-7 years with no wiggle room. Javier Baez, the recent projection I saw from MLB Trade Rumors, was 5 years, $100 million. 20 a year over 5 years to me is a pretty fair deal. I have talked in the past about a 3-year contract for Baez that would be very similar to the deal that Yoenis Cespedes signed after the 2015 season. Front loaded a $27.5 million first year salary with an opt out. It makes a lot of sense. But if he wants that long term security, if he wants to know that he's in a place and he doesn't have to think about free agency again, he can really just lock in with his best friend and move out to New York and all that. That makes a lot of sense. We'll see what Stroman ultimately commands. If he ends up getting into that $150 million range, maybe the Mets are going to pass on him, but you have to address that rotation in another way because that would be a big loss. And Starling Marte, again, he's a player that is going to cost a premium, but I think that it is worth it to get the only free agent outfielder on the market that can replace Michael Conforto's production both offensively and defensively. So if the Mets make those three signings, I think they'll be in great shape with their starting lineup, their starting rotation. They obviously will still have to build out a bullpen, add depth across the board. These are things you have to do every offseason. But when it comes to the big ticket options, Stroman, Baez, Marte, that is the offseason I am most interested in when we're talking about realistic options. But hey, if you want to start dreaming about the Bryants and the Correas of the world, of course, you can come to Locked On Mets every day throughout the offseason as these rumors pop up. We will explore all of them. But as always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow this show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On MLB Prospects, hosted by my guy RM Layton. Locked On MLB Prospects is the best way to keep up on the stars of tomorrow. Follow Locked On MLB Prospects wherever you get podcasts.